Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Tonight I'll talk about something that sits quietly underneath a lot of the decisions people make. The relationships they stay in, the work they do, the version of themselves they present to the world. The feeling that you owe something to someone, to everyone. That your life is, in some fundamental way, already spoken for. Write in the comments what time it is for you right now, or just tell me how your day went. The people who show up here tend to be warm and genuinely thoughtful, and reading what they write is one of the real pleasures of doing this. If the Night Tide Project means something to you, there's a link in the description where you can support it. There's a sentence that most people carry around without ever examining it. I owe you. 3 words. And they function in daily life with a force that almost no other sentence can match. Stronger than I want. Stronger than I need. Certainly stronger than please. The language of debt reaches somewhere that a simple request doesn't, because it implies that the answer has already been decided. That refusal isn't a choice, it's a violation. What I want to spend time with tonight is that structure, where it comes from, what it costs, and what it might mean to actually live outside of it. Not as a thought experiment, not as a fantasy of disconnection from everyone around you, but as a serious philosophical position about how a life can be lived. The question underneath all of this is not comfortable. It goes something like this. If you don't owe anyone anything, is that freedom, or is it just another name for indifference? And the honest answer, the one that holds up across the full weight of the idea, is that this is the wrong way to frame the question. The real question is what it means to give something, to commit to something, to love someone, when all of that is genuinely chosen rather than extracted from you by pressure you were never asked to consent to. That distinction between chosen and imposed is where the whole philosophy lives. And it turns out to be much harder to locate than it sounds. Because most of what feels chosen, if you follow it back far enough, was decided before you had the language to decide anything at all. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that we are condemned to be free, meaning that the absence of predetermined purpose is not a gift, but a burden. You cannot hand your life's meaning back to anyone else and call it resolved. Someone else's expectation of you is not the same as your own answer to what your life is for. That gap between what you are expected to be and what you might actually choose to be is one of the oldest and most uncomfortable gaps in philosophy, and it does not close on its own. What makes this particular topic so strange is how rarely it gets examined. People talk about obligation constantly. They feel the weight of it constantly. They organize enormous portions of their time and energy around managing it, and almost nobody stops to ask what the thing actually is, where it comes from, whether it was ever agreed to, whether the person who feels it most intensely is the one with the most developed moral sense, or simply the one most effectively trained to comply. Those are not the same thing. The intensity of a feeling is not evidence of its validity. And guilt, which is probably the most powerful enforcer of obligation in daily life, is worth looking at very carefully, because what guilt actually tracks in most people's experience, and what it claims to track, are not reliably the same. Tonight, that's the territory. Not a simple one, not one that resolves cleanly. The kind of question you carry differently after you've sat with it for a while, not because you've found the answer, but because you've understood something more precise about what was being asked. The word obligation is doing specific work whenever it appears. It is not a neutral description of a relationship between people. It is a claim about what you owe, and that claim is always made in moral language. Always. You will almost never hear someone say, "I want you to do this for me." What you hear instead is, "You should. You're supposed to. After everything I've done. That's just what family does." The request has been translated into a debt. And the translation is not accidental. Moral language is chosen because it is structurally harder to refuse. A simple want can be weighed, considered, declined with a reason. A debt carries a different gravity. It implies that refusal is already a kind of wrongdoing. That you are not making a choice, but committing a default. The move from "I want" to "you owe" is a move from negotiation to enforcement, and most people make it without realizing they have made anything at all. This is what it means to call obligation a social construction. The point is not that obligations are fake or that nothing carries genuine weight. The point is that the moral framing attached to an obligation is added to it. It is not inherent in the situation. Someone needing something from you does not automatically generate a debt on your side. But the language of debt is applied anyway, because it works, because it produces compliance more reliably than a straightforward request would, and because it is very difficult to examine a feeling once it has been dressed in the vocabulary of right and wrong. Consider what that vocabulary actually says. "You owe me" suggests there was a transaction, that something was given, and now something is due in return. Sometimes that is true in a literal sense. You borrowed money. You made a promise. You entered an agreement. In those cases, the language of debt describes something real, a voluntary arrangement with a voluntary consequence. That is one category of obligation, and it has genuine weight precisely because it was entered freely. Then there is the other category, the obligations that arrived without negotiation, that were announced rather than agreed to, that accumulated through repetition and emotional pressure until they felt as natural as gravity. The obligation to make certain choices because your family expects them, to manage other people's feelings because you have always managed them, to remain available, to remain accommodating, to remain the person who does not cause difficulty. Because at some point, before you had any clear sense of who you were, that role was assigned, and it was assigned in moral language, so it stuck. The crucial question is whether those two categories feel different from the inside. For most people, they do not, or they do not at first. Both arrive with the weight of should. Both produce guilt when violated. The vocabulary of debt treats them as equivalent, and the feeling of debt confirms that equivalence. But they are not the same thing at all. One is a structure you entered, the other is a structure that entered you. You can feel this, if you pay attention, in the specific quality of the guilt that follows from each. Breaking a promise you voluntarily made produces a different feeling than failing to meet an expectation you never consented to. The first carries a sense of internal betrayal. You went against something you had committed to. The second carries a sense of social danger. You have disappointed someone, disrupted a pattern, made yourself inconvenient. Both feelings are uncomfortable. Only one of them is tracking something you actually agreed to. The significance of this distinction is not mainly emotional. It is structural. If you cannot tell the difference between an obligation you chose and an obligation that was assigned to you, then the whole architecture of your daily life, your time, your attention, your energy, your choices, is being organized around a category you have never examined. The debts you are paying may be real debts, or they may be the social equivalent of a bill sent to the wrong address that you have been paying faithfully because it kept arriving, and no one ever told you that you were allowed to question it. What does it cost to keep paying without questioning? That is not a rhetorical question. The cost is specific.
It shows up in the decisions not made, the directions not taken, the things wanted but never pursued, because the wanting felt illegitimate beside the weight of what was owed. It shows up in the slow, unremarked narrowing of what feels available to a person, not because external circumstances have closed down, but because the space inside the obligation has contracted around them without their noticing. The distinction between chosen and imposed sits at the center of the whole philosophy, and the reason it is hard to locate is not that the categories are blurry in theory, they are sharp in theory. What makes them hard to locate is that imposed obligations come wearing the same emotional clothing as chosen ones. They feel like yours. They feel like you. And that feeling, that sense of deep personal ownership over a value or a commitment, is precisely what the vocabulary of moral debt is designed to produce. Guilt arrives before thought does. That is the first thing worth noticing about it. Something happens. You decline a request. You choose your own plans over someone else's. You simply stop being available in the way you were available before. And before you have had a single moment to assess what actually occurred, the feeling is already there. Heavy, specific, unmistakable. And the weight of it functions as its own argument. As if the intensity of a feeling were proof of what it means.
That is the mechanism. Guilt does not wait for evaluation. It is not a conclusion reached through reflection. It is a sensation that arrives ahead of reflection, specifically to prevent it. By the time you begin asking whether the guilt makes sense, you are already inside it, and everything you think from that position is colored by the pressure to resolve it, to repair whatever was broken, to restore what was disrupted, which means, in practice, to comply with whatever expectation was violated. Watch what guilt actually points to, in the specific situations where you feel it most reliably. Not in the abstract, not in cases of genuine harm, but in the ordinary situations of daily life, the ones that generate the quiet, persistent, low-level guilt that most people carry around without naming. You didn't call back soon enough. You made a decision someone else disapproved of. You took time for something that mattered to you instead of something that mattered to someone else. You allowed a need of your own to sit at the same level of importance as someone else's need, and that felt, in some complicated way, like a transgression. The question is, what principle was violated there? Not which expectation, not whose feeling was hurt, but what actual principle, one you consciously hold, one you could name if pressed, was transgressed. For most people, following that question honestly leads somewhere uncomfortable. The guilt traces back to an expectation. Someone wanted something, expected something, had organized their emotional state around receiving something, and when they didn't receive it, they registered disappointment or frustration, and you felt that registration as guilt. The gap between your action and their expectation produced a signal that your nervous system categorized as wrongdoing. But the expectation was theirs. The emotional response was theirs. What you actually did was make a choice, and the choice did not belong to them. A woman decides to spend her weekend working on something she has wanted to finish for months instead of attending a family gathering. No one is harmed. No prior commitment was broken. She had not promised to be there. But the guilt is immediate and persistent because the gathering was expected, because her presence was assumed, because her absence registers as a disruption of a pattern that has been treated as obligatory without ever having been explicitly agreed to. The guilt feels like a moral signal. What it is actually tracking is the distance between her choice and the assumption others held about her behavior. This distinction matters enormously, because if you treat guilt as a moral compass, if you navigate by it, let it steer decisions, treat its presence as evidence that something genuinely wrong has occurred, then you have outsourced your ethical life to a feeling that is calibrated to other people's expectations, not to your own considered values. You are not consulting your principles. You are consulting a social enforcement system that was installed in you long before you had principles to consult. The reliability of guilt as a signal is exactly inverse to how reliable it feels. It is most insistent, most overwhelming, most convincing of its own authority in precisely those situations where it is doing the most enforcement work on behalf of other people's comfort and least tracking of anything you actually agreed to care about. The sensation is real. The moral content is not guaranteed, not even approximately guaranteed, by the intensity of the sensation alone. What genuine moral discomfort actually feels like is different, and most people know the difference when they stop to look. When you do something that genuinely violates a value you hold, the feeling has a different character. It is less about what the other person will think or feel, less about the social disruption your action created, and more about the gap between who you are trying to be and what you just did. It is oriented inward, not outward. It does not resolve when the other person stops being upset, because the other person's emotional state was never the actual point. Social guilt resolves the moment the expectation is met again. You call back, you show up, you accommodate, and the feeling lifts, not because anything morally significant was repaired, but because the pattern was restored. That resolution is the tell. A feeling that vanishes when compliance resumes is a feeling that was always about compliance. It had nothing to do with ethics at the moment it arrived, and the relief you feel when you comply is not the relief of having done the right thing. It is the relief of having stopped the pressure. Living with that understanding does not make the feeling disappear. Guilt generated by violated expectations is a genuine emotional experience, and it persists even when you can see exactly what it is doing. What changes is the relationship you can have with it. You can feel the feeling without treating it as an instruction. You can let the pressure exist without letting the pressure decide. That capacity to recognize a feeling as data about your social environment rather than as a verdict about your character is not comfortable to develop. It requires sitting with discomfort that your entire emotional architecture is telling you to resolve immediately by giving someone what they expected from you. The thing that makes this genuinely hard is not emotional weakness. It is the fact that the mechanism was built in early, built deep, and was described to you at the time as your conscience. When guilt was installed under the name of moral feeling, when the adults who shaped your earliest understanding of right and wrong used your discomfort at disappointing them as the primary teaching tool, the enforcement signal and the ethical signal became almost impossible to separate from the inside. They feel like the same thing. They have always felt like the same thing, and most people never have a reason to question that conflation, because questioning it means sitting with something that feels very much like being a bad person. And most people, understandably, find a way to avoid that as quickly as possible. There is a paradox at the center of a life spent entirely in service of other people's needs, and it is not the paradox most people expect. The expected version goes like this: you give too much, you get resentment in return. That is a real enough problem, but it is not the deepest one. The deeper paradox is this: the more completely you shape yourself around what others require of you, the less of you there is left to shape. And the vanishing is gradual enough that you do not notice it happening until it is already extensive. Name the paradox precisely,
because the name matters. A person who organizes their entire existence around fulfilling external expectations does not become more defined through that process. They become less defined. The constant responsiveness, the continuous adjustment to what is wanted, the permanent availability, none of that builds a self. It erodes one. And the erosion is invisible from the outside because the person performing it looks, from any external vantage point, like exactly what a good person is supposed to look like. Generous, reliable, present, accommodating. The performance of selfhood has never been easier to mistake for selfhood itself. What makes this a genuine paradox, rather than simply an irony, is that the disappearance is total compliance, not failure. You do not lose yourself because you fell short of what was expected. You lose yourself because you succeeded. Every expectation met, every social debt serviced, every need of someone else placed ahead of any restless, half-formed need of your own. And at the end of that process, there is a person who is tremendously skilled at being what others require, and has almost no idea what they actually want, think, or value when no one is requiring anything. Consider what that actually means as a lived experience. You ask such a person what they want, for dinner, for a vacation, for their life in 5 years, and they hesitate in a particular way. Not the hesitation of someone thinking carefully, the hesitation of someone genuinely scanning for the answer and finding the signal weak. The preference machinery is underdeveloped, not because something went wrong in some dramatic sense, but because preference is a faculty that atrophies when it is never exercised. When every decision has been organized around what would be easiest for others, around what would avoid conflict, around what would satisfy the expectation rather than the desires themselves stop generating clear signals. They go quiet. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but quiet enough that the person can no longer locate them without effort.
This is where the attempt at resolution usually appears. The obvious move is to say that self-knowledge can be recovered, that with enough space and enough silence, the preferences come back. The self reasserts itself. The buried desires surface. And that is true, in a limited sense. Space helps. Silence helps. But the resolution is not as clean as that, because the person who spent years organized around compliance has also internalized the framework that made compliance feel necessary. The habits of self-erasure do not dissolve just because the external expectations temporarily lift. They are still operative inside the person. The voice that says, "But what will they think?" does not require the presence of a "they" to remain audible. That is why the resolution is impossible to complete from the inside using only will. You cannot simply decide to stop disappearing. The disappearing was not a decision in the first place. It was a slow accumulation of small adjustments, each one sensible in context, each one reasonable given the pressure of the moment, each one indistinguishable from ordinary social cooperation, until you add them all up and see the shape they have made. A self that was never directly refused. A self that was made progressively smaller through 1,000 reasonable accommodations. The arithmetic of it is brutal when you finally see it, because there was no single moment to refuse, no single crisis to have responded to differently. It happened in the aggregate. The self formed entirely under obligation is not a self that made bad choices. It is a self that was structurally prevented from making choices at the level where character is actually formed, the level of genuine preference, genuine refusal, genuine desire that does not reference anyone else's comfort in its first moment of arising.
You have preferences about things that do not involve other people. Most obligation-organized selves have almost no developed relationship with that territory, because the question, "What do I want here?" entirely independent of what would be convenient for others, was never the question being asked. And this is where the paradox bites hardest. The person who has dissolved into compliance is, in a very specific sense, unreachable. The people around them are not in relationship with a self, they are in relationship with a function. A function that produces what is wanted when it is wanted, and suppresses whatever would complicate that production. The function may be deeply skilled and genuinely warm, may carry enormous amounts of care and attention. But care expressed by a function is structurally different from care expressed by a self. One of them knows why it cares. The other has never had to examine the question because the caring was always framed as given, as obvious, as simply what you do.
What this means for you specifically is something worth sitting with rather than resolving quickly. If the self you present to the world has been substantially shaped by what others needed it to be, not your enemies, not people who meant you harm, but the ordinary people in your life, whose needs were real and whose expectations were understandable, then the project of recovering what is genuinely yours is not an emotional project. It is not a question of feeling your feelings more fully or expressing yourself more openly. It is a structural project. It requires asking, with real seriousness, which parts of how you move through the world were chosen, and which parts were simply occupied, the way water occupies the shape of its container. That question does not come with a clean answer. It does not arrive once and resolve itself. It resurfaces in ordinary moments, in the hesitation before saying what you actually think, in the automatic reach for accommodation when accommodation was not asked for, in the slight but real relief you feel when someone else makes a decision so that you do not have to navigate the weight of having made one. Those small signals are not personality traits. They are the residue of a structure, and the structure was not your fault, but it is your inheritance, and the question of what you do with it remains entirely open in a way that cannot be closed by any external authority, including this one. There is an assumption so embedded in the way people talk about their own inner lives that it almost never gets examined directly. The assumption is this: if you feel something deeply enough, if a belief about yourself or the world has been present since early childhood, if a value is so fundamental to how you operate that you cannot remember a time before it, then it must be yours. It must have originated somewhere in you, grown from something genuinely internal. Depth of feeling and length of tenure become evidence of authenticity. The longer something has been there, the more it seems to belong.
That assumption is doing a great deal of work that it cannot actually support. Values that were absorbed before you had the cognitive equipment to evaluate them feel indistinguishable from values you chose. That is not a metaphor. The neurological and psychological reality of early value formation is that the material arrives before any critical apparatus is in place to receive it selectively. A child does not weigh a moral proposition and decide to accept it. The moral proposition lands, and it lands in a mind that is structured, at that stage, primarily to absorb. The family's framework for what counts as good behavior, what constitutes a proper relationship to other people's needs, what kind of person earns approval, all of this arrives as information about reality, not as one possible framework among many. It is absorbed the way language is absorbed. And just as you cannot remember learning your first language, you cannot remember learning the values that were installed earliest, because there was no moment of learning in the sense that would allow you to identify it later as a choice. What this means is that the conviction you feel when you believe something deeply
may have nothing to do with whether you would choose that belief if you encountered it fresh, as an adult, with full access to your own considered experience. The conviction is an artifact of depth, not of genuine endorsement. You feel certain, not because you have examined the value and found it sound, but because the value has been present for so long that certainty about it feels like certainty about yourself. Someone who grew up in a household where need was dangerous, where expressing a personal want created conflict, disrupted the atmosphere, or was met with withdrawal, absorbs a value that looks like consideration for others, but is functionally a prohibition against taking up space. That value will feel, from the inside, like genuine selflessness, like a real commitment to putting others first. The person who carries it will often be described by others as exceptionally generous, admirably low maintenance. The experience of the value feels nothing like a wound. It feels like character. And the moment someone suggests that this particular quality might not be freely chosen, that it might have been installed under conditions that made it necessary rather than selected on its own merits, the resistance is immediate and real, because what is being questioned feels like the self.
That resistance is the mechanism worth examining. When a challenge to an inherited value produces something that feels like a challenge to your identity, that response is not evidence that the value is genuinely yours. It is evidence of how thoroughly the value was internalized. The closer something sits to the center of your self-concept, the harder it is to hold at arm's length long enough to actually look at it. Which means the values most worth examining are exactly the ones that feel most obviously beyond examination. The distinction between inherited and chosen values is not about origin in time. It is about endorsement. A value can arrive early and still be genuinely yours if you have at some point held it up, seen what it asks of you, understood why it exists, and decided to keep it. The question is not where it came from. The question is whether you have ever actually looked at it, or whether it has simply been there, operating below the level of review, shaping decisions and producing guilt and structuring relationships without ever having been asked to justify itself. Most people, if pressed, discover that their core sense of what they owe other people has never been examined at that level. It was received, it was reinforced, it became the water they swim in. And because it is the water, it does not look like an assumption, it looks like reality. The belief that you are obligated to prioritize family needs over personal desires, for example, does not present itself as a belief. It presents itself as how things obviously are. The belief that your needs are slightly less legitimate than other people's needs, that your comfort is an acceptable sacrifice while theirs is a genuine claim on your behavior, that does not arrive as a proposition to evaluate. It arrives as background, as atmosphere, as the tone of every moral assessment you make about yourself. Living your life by values you absorbed rather than chose is not comfortable and virtuous the way it is sometimes described. It is something more like administering a program written by people who could not have known who you were going to be. The program may be sophisticated. It may contain genuine moral insight. It may have served you well in many situations. None of that means it was ever calibrated to your actual life, your actual capacities, your actual reasons for being on Earth. A value that was handed to you without your consent and that you have never examined cannot bear the weight of a whole life's worth of choices. It can produce consistent behavior. Consistency is not the same thing as meaning.
The work of actually looking at what you value, not what you were taught to value, not what you would be embarrassed to admit you don't value, but what genuinely matters to you when you follow the thread of your own experience carefully. That work is uncomfortable in a specific way. It involves the real possibility of discovering that some of what you have been performing as your character is not your character at all. That some of the obligations you have been servicing were never yours to service. That the guilt you feel when you fail to meet certain expectations is guilt generated by a standard you did not set and do not, on examination, actually endorse. And that discovery does not simplify anything. It does not hand you a different, better set of values ready-made. What it does is create a gap, a moment of genuine open territory between the inherited framework and whatever comes next. That gap is uncomfortable precisely because it is real. It is the actual space where choosing happens, and choosing requires something that operating on absorbed values never required from you. It requires standing in the uncertainty of your own preferences without the scaffolding of what you were supposed to want, and finding out, by the only method available, what is actually there. The question of which of your values you would genuinely choose, if you could meet them as proposals rather than as inheritance, is not a question with a clean answer, and it is not a question you answer once. It reopens every time you notice that something you are doing for another person feels more like executing a script than like genuinely giving. Every time, the relief of meeting an expectation feels less like satisfaction and more like cessation of pressure. Every time you catch yourself asking not what you want, but what will go over best. Those are not personality traits. They are signals from the gap between the values you absorbed and the values you might actually choose, if you gave yourself the real, uncomfortable space to choose. When someone calls you selfish, something specific happens in the moment. There is a pull, immediate, visceral, organizational, toward defending yourself, explaining yourself, demonstrating that the accusation is wrong. The pull is so strong that it almost never occurs to anyone to pause and ask a prior question. What is the accusation actually doing here? And why is it arriving now?
That question is worth taking seriously, because the timing of the selfishness accusation is almost never random.
Notice when it tends to appear. It appears when you have declined something, when you have redirected attention toward your own needs, when you have said in some form that this particular thing will not work for you. The accusation follows refusal the way a shadow follows a body, not because refusal is evidence of selfishness, but because the accusation is designed to reverse the refusal. It is a mechanism before it is a moral judgment. And treating it as a moral judgment, which most people do instinctively, means engaging with it on its own chosen terrain, where it has every structural advantage. The word selfish carries enormous freight in most people's inner vocabulary because it was one of the earliest moral categories installed. Children learn very young that selfishness is among the worst things you can be. The category arrives early, charged, and non-negotiable. By the time you are old enough to examine it, the word already has weight that precedes any specific definition. So when someone deploys it against you as an adult, they are not just making a claim about your current behavior, they are activating something much older, a pre-examined conviction that selfishness is a fundamental moral failure, something a good person must immediately address and correct. What that activation produces is compliance. Not considered reflective compliance, automatic compliance. The accused person redirects, returns, adjusts, and the relationship or situation returns to the equilibrium that existed before the refusal, which was, almost certainly, the goal. Think about who actually uses this word against you, and when. A stranger who has no investment in your behavior has no reason to call you selfish for prioritizing your own needs.
The accusation appears inside relationships, specifically inside relationships where your compliance has been part of the structure. A parent who expected you to arrange your schedule around family demands. A partner whose emotional stability has been, in part, maintained by your consistent availability. A friend whose sense of your relationship is organized around your readiness to subordinate your preferences to theirs. These are not bad people in some simple way. The dependency on your compliance may have developed gradually, invisibly, with no one's explicit intent. But the structural reality is that your self-erasure became a resort, and the accusation of selfishness is what emerges when you withdraw it. That is the thing underneath the accusation that almost never gets named directly. The accusation feels like a moral assessment. What it actually expresses is something more like alarm. The alarm of someone whose established arrangement with you is being disrupted. Their comfort has been calibrated to your availability. Their expectations have been built on your pattern of meeting them. When you introduce a refusal into that system, it registers to them not as you exercising a legitimate preference, but as you removing something they had come to experience as simply there. And the experience of losing something you believed was simply there generates a response that reaches for the strongest available moral vocabulary.
So when someone tells you that declining something is selfish, what you are often hearing is not a considered ethical position. You are hearing the sound of an arrangement being destabilized. The vocabulary is moral. The content is relational disruption. These are not the same thing, and treating them as the same thing, which most people do because the accusation is designed to collapse that distinction, is how the mechanism works. There is a version of this that is more sympathetic than it first appears. The people who rely most heavily on the selfishness accusation are often people who have never had an expectation cleanly refused before. Every time a previous version of you approached the edge of refusal, the accusation arrived and the refusal retreated. So from their perspective, your sudden unwillingness to comply genuinely does feel like a change in your character, a withdrawal of something they understood as stable. They are not wrong that something has changed. They are wrong about what the change means morally. A person reaching for their own preferences is not taking something that belonged to someone else. But it will feel that way to someone who had come to experience those preferences as permanently subordinated. And that felt sense, the sense that something was taken, is where the moral language comes from. Not from philosophy, not from an actual accounting of what is owed, but from the discomfort of losing an arrangement that was comfortable. Understanding this does not require you to dismiss the discomfort. The discomfort is real. The disruption is real. People do organize their lives around each other, and when one person's behavior shifts, it creates genuine turbulence that the other person has to navigate. None of that is nothing. But real disruption and moral transgression are different events, and the accusation of selfishness attempts to treat them as identical, to dress the experience of relational turbulence in the language of ethical failure, because ethical language is much harder to dismiss than relational disappointment. What makes this accusation particularly difficult to examine clearly is that it does sometimes land on real selfishness. People do sometimes prioritize their own needs in ways that genuinely damage others, that involve indifference to real harm, that represent a failure of care rather than an exercise of it. The word is not always a weapon. Sometimes it is an accurate description. The difficulty is that the accusation feels accurate, whether it is accurate or whether it is tactical. The feeling of being called selfish
does not come with a readout that tells you which kind you are dealing with. The way through that difficulty is not to ignore the accusation, but to examine it with a different question than the one it implies. The implied question is, have I done something wrong? And that question, answered in the heat of the accusation's arrival, almost always produces a defensive scramble to demonstrate that you haven't, which leaves the original refusal in the dust. The more useful question is, whose comfort was disturbed by what I did, and was I obligated to maintain it? That question does not collapse under pressure, the way the first one does. It stays structural. It asks about arrangements and obligations, rather than about virtue and guilt. And it frequently reveals that what is being called selfish is the simple act of existing as a person with preferences of your own, rather than as a function that reliably produces what was expected. The cost of accepting the selfishness accusation without examining it is not just that you return to compliance in the immediate situation. It is that each acceptance reconfirms internally that your preferences are a lesser category of claim than other people's expectations. You come to believe, not through any deliberate reasoning, but through accumulated capitulation, that wanting something for yourself is already a moral liability, that the very emergence of a personal preference requires justification in a way that other people's expectations do not. That asymmetry, once internalized, shapes everything. It shapes what you allow yourself to want, what you believe you are allowed to ask for, what you feel the moment before you consider prioritizing something that matters to you. The accusation, accepted uncritically often enough, becomes a preemptive voice that does not need to be voiced by anyone else to be effective. You carry the mechanism inside. And this is where the question of your own values becomes immediate rather than abstract. Because if you have absorbed the framework that says your preferences are automatically suspect, that prioritizing yourself is inherently morally questionable, then examining that framework is not a peripheral exercise in philosophical clarity. It is a direct confrontation with a structure that is actively shaping what you believe you are allowed to be. The question is not whether selfishness is real. It is whether the accusation you have been accepting, internally and externally, was ever an accurate description of you, or whether it was a mechanism that found in you a particularly compliant audience and never had to work very hard to keep you in line. There is a moment in a long relationship, any kind of relationship, with a parent, a partner, a close friend, when you realize that the care you have been expressing and the obligation you have been fulfilling have become impossible to separate from each other. The gestures look identical, the words are the same, but underneath, something is different, and the difference is not visible from the outside. It is only visible to the person performing the gesture, and only then if they are willing to look. Love, as most people experience it and describe it, is supposed to be the clearest thing, the most obvious, the least in need of examination. And yet the conflation of love with duty is so common, so structurally embedded in how intimate relationships function, that most people have never had occasion to notice when one has become the other. They are treated as overlapping categories at best, and as identical at worst. The consequence of that treatment is not a theoretical problem. It is something that accumulates quietly in the texture of daily life, in the quality of attention you bring to someone, in whether your presence in a relationship carries genuine weight or merely carries compliance. When love becomes the language through which duty is enforced, when "because I love you" is the explanation given for why you must arrange yourself in a particular way, be available in a particular way, sacrifice a particular thing, the word love begins to lose its actual content. It becomes load-bearing in a structural sense, while emptying out in an experiential one. You hear it, and something in you recognizes that what is being asked is not really a request from love. It is a claim framed in the vocabulary of love, because that vocabulary is more binding than a direct demand. You can negotiate with a demand. You can question a rule. A declaration of love, used as leverage, reaches deeper than either.
The mechanism operates in the other direction with equal damage. When duty is performed in the name of love, when you continue to show up, continue to give, continue to arrange yourself around someone's needs because you believe that is what love requires, regardless of whether the genuine feeling is driving it, the performance becomes its own kind of hollowing. The actions look like love from the outside. They may even produce effects indistinguishable from love's effects. The person receiving them may feel cared for, but the person performing them begins to lose access to the distinction between what they genuinely feel and what they have committed to performing. Over time, that loss of access is not a small thing. It is a structural erosion of the self's ability to know its own interior. What this means at scale is significant. Entire relationship architectures get built on this substitution. A marriage in which both people are fulfilling obligations framed as love produces, outwardly, a relationship that looks coherent. Appointments kept, presence maintained, needs serviced. The internal experience is a different matter. Each person is managing a set of expectations rather than responding to a genuine other. The emotional texture of the relationship is compliance dressed as intimacy. And because no one names the substitution, because the vocabulary of love is covering the machinery of duty, there is no purchase point from which the relationship can be honestly examined. To examine it would require acknowledging that some of what has been called love was something else, and that acknowledgement carries its own devastation. The question this raises is not whether duty has any place in love. It almost certainly does. Long relationships require showing up on days when you do not feel like showing up. Care involves obligations that persist through fluctuations in feeling. The argument here is not that love should be free of all structure or commitment. The argument is more precise than that. It is about what happens when duty is allowed to fully replace the genuine response, when the structure of obligation becomes so dominant that the actual feeling becomes irrelevant to the operation of the relationship. At that point, what you have is not a relationship supported by structure. You have a structure that has consumed the relationship. A person who genuinely loves someone and who has genuinely chosen to commit to that person can, on a given day, not feel like showing up and still show up. And that act carries the weight of chosen responsibility. The showing up is an expression of something real. A person who has never separated love from duty cannot make that distinction at all. For them, every act of care looks the same from the inside, because the felt sense of love and the felt pressure of obligation have become so thoroughly fused that neither can be isolated. They do not know, when they do something for the person they are supposed to love, whether they are expressing care or executing a commitment. And that not knowing is not a minor emotional ambiguity. It is the loss of something that makes intimate life meaningful. The systemic consequence, and this is where the individual experience opens into something broader, is that entire generations can be raised inside relationship models where love and duty were so completely conflated that the distinction was never made available as a concept. You absorbed a picture of love that included, built in, the expectation that love means perpetual availability, perpetual sacrifice, perpetual subordination of your own needs to the needs of the relationship. The picture was called love. It was passed on as love. The people who gave it to you probably received it as love as well.
At no point in this inheritance was anyone invited to ask whether what was being transmitted was actually love, or whether it was a functional arrangement that borrowed love's name because love's name makes everything harder to question. This is not an accusation. The people who passed this framework along were themselves operating inside it, without the outside vantage point from which the substitution would be visible. The transmission was genuine, in the sense that there was no deception involved. But genuine transmission of an unexamined framework is still transmission of an unexamined framework. And the result, for the person who inherits it, is that love becomes one of the most obligated territories in their life, the place where the expectations are highest, where the vocabulary of debt is most charged, where the accusation of failing to love carries the most devastating weight.
Which raises the open question that this cannot resolve simply. If you have spent years inside a relationship, or a whole history of relationships, in which love and duty were fused, and you begin to separate them, what do you discover? You might discover that the genuine feeling is still there, underneath the obligation, and that separating the two actually restores something that was being obscured. You might discover that the genuine feeling was eroded by years of performing it under obligation, and that what remains is thinner than you expected. You might discover that the obligation was always covering an absence, that the relationship was built on the structure because the structure was all there was. Any of these discoveries changes things. None of them is easy. And the difficulty is not a reason to avoid the examination. It is evidence of how much weight was being held in place by a conflation that was never named. There is a rule that runs underneath most of what children are taught about being good, and it is not the rule that gets announced. The announced rules are the visible ones. Share your things. Be kind to others. Consider how your actions affect the people around you. Those rules have names. They get repeated, explained, illustrated with examples. What does not get explained is the deeper structural principle that organizes all of them, that the primary function of a person from an early age is to remain predictable and cooperative inside the social arrangements they were born into. That principle does not need to be stated. It is demonstrated repeatedly through what gets rewarded and what gets punished. When a child complies, the atmosphere around them eases. When a child refuses, even a reasonable refusal, even a refusal that makes complete sense from inside the child's experience, the social temperature drops. Something in the environment communicates that refusal has costs, not always explicitly, not always through punishment in any formal sense, but through the quality of attention, through approval and its withdrawal, through the subtle but readable difference in how adults respond to a cooperative child versus a child who is figuring out that they have preferences worth protecting. The moral vocabulary gets attached to all of this. Compliance gets called good. Refusal, depending on how persistent it is, gets called difficult or selfish or inconsiderate. The categories are moral. The function they are serving is social. The distinction matters enormously. Moral categories are supposed to track things that have genuine ethical weight: harm, fairness, the interests of other people who can be affected by your actions. Social categories track something different: predictability, cooperation, the smooth functioning of a particular arrangement. A child who refuses to share a toy in a specific situation may or may not be doing something morally significant. Whether they are depends on details: whose toy it is, what the context is, whether there is any genuine harm being caused. A child who refuses to comply with an adult's convenience is almost certainly not doing anything morally significant at all. The conflation of the two
treating non-compliance as ethical failure, regardless of its actual content, is how social regulation gets installed as moral conscience. You carry this installation forward. The person you became as an adult has, built into the base layer of their moral intuitions, a strong association between meeting other people's expectations and being a good person, and between prioritizing your own needs and doing something that requires justification. That association is not the result of philosophical reasoning. It is the residue of an education that used moral language to achieve social ends, and that did so not through malice, not through any deliberate program, but because that is how social orders perpetuate themselves. They require people who internalize the costs of non-compliance deeply enough that those costs do not need to be externally enforced. The most efficient compliance is the kind that doesn't feel like compliance at all, the kind that feels like virtue. There is something important to understand about this. It is not a conspiracy. The adults who installed these frameworks in you were themselves operating inside them. The teachers and parents who taught you that disruption was selfishness and cooperation was goodness were transmitting something they had received in exactly this form from the generation that shaped them. The social machinery does not require anyone to understand what it is doing in order to do it. It reproduces through genuine belief. The people conveying it believed it. That makes the transmission more complete, not less. If the adults around you had known they were installing social compliance under the name of ethics, their delivery might have been less convincing. Because they believed it was ethics, it landed as ethics.
A child learns what a good person does from the people they trust most, in the years before they have any independent framework for assessing those lessons. By the time critical capacity develops, the lessons are already foundational, not beliefs you hold, but the ground beneath your beliefs. Examining them feels less like updating an opinion and more like questioning the flaw. Consider what happens to a person who, at 40 or 30 or 25, begins to notice this. They have spent years experiencing obligation as moral reality, experiencing the discomfort of non-compliance as guilt, experiencing their own preferences as things that need justification before they can be acted on. They look back at the architecture and begin to see the engineering underneath it, the way the vocabulary of ethics was doing a different kind of work than ethics actually does. That recognition does not automatically free them from anything. Recognizing a mechanism while you are inside it does not instantly dissolve its effects. But something shifts. There is a difference between a rule that feels like a fact of the universe and a rule that you can see was constructed for a purpose. The second kind can be questioned. The first kind cannot even be held up to the light, because you do not know it is there. What you find, when you hold it up, is that a great deal of what you were taught about being a good person is specifically oriented toward making you cooperative, available, and non-disruptive to other people's established arrangements. Not all of it. Some of what you were taught tracks genuine ethical content, tracks real harm and real care and real fairness. The work is in learning to tell the difference. The things that produce genuine harm to other people are worth keeping. The things that produce social smoothness while requiring your self-erasure are worth examining, because their cost is not distributed evenly. The cost lands on you, and that cost, which accumulates gradually and silently, is not something the social order has any structural reason to account for. The order benefits from your compliance. It does not benefit from your examination. Every person who begins to separate the ethical content of an obligation from its social function is, in a modest but real way, introducing friction
into a machine that runs on the absence of friction. That friction is not rebellion. It does not require a dramatic stance. It is simply the act of asking whether a given obligation corresponds to a genuine ethical claim or to an expectation that found its way into moral language because moral language is harder to refuse. Asking that question regularly about the obligations you carry is not a posture. It is a practice. And the practice changes what you are willing to carry. There is a gap at the center of every major philosophical tradition that those traditions have rarely been willing to name directly. The gap is this. Ethical theory, in all its forms, tells you how to act in relation to other people. It tells you what you owe them, what principles should govern your choices, what counts as harm, what fairness requires, what a rational agent would do. What it does not tell you, what it structurally cannot tell you, is what your particular life is for.
Kantian ethics gives you a test for the universalizability of your maxims. It tells you to act only according to principles you could will to be universal law. The framework is rigorous and genuinely demanding. But it says nothing about which of the many universalizable paths available to you corresponds to the life you actually want to be living. It adjudicates the ethics of your actions. It has nothing to say about their direction. Utilitarian calculation asks you to weigh outcomes, to maximize welfare, to consider every affected party in your moral arithmetic. Applied carefully, it produces answers to specific questions about consequences and trade-offs. But no utilitarian calculus tells you what to optimize for when the question is your own life taken as a whole. You can run the numbers on individual decisions. The question of what kind of person you are trying to become, what kind of years you are trying to live, what would constitute a life well spent for you specifically, those questions do not have inputs that can be entered into a welfare function. The framework sits silent in front of them. Communitarian ethics, at least, acknowledges that you are embedded in particular relationships, particular histories, a particular community that has its own character and claims. It argues, with real force, that the liberal picture of the radically autonomous individual floating free of all prior attachment is a fiction, that you are always already situated, that your identity is constituted partly through your memberships and your loyalties. That argument is worth taking seriously. The embeddedness is real, the memberships are real, but acknowledging that you are situated inside a community does not tell you which of your community's claims on you are genuinely yours to carry, and which arrived on your doorstep wrapped in the vocabulary of belonging before you were old enough to sort the package. Community gives you context. It does not give you a filter. The point of intersection across all these frameworks, the place where Kantian rigor and utilitarian consequence and communitarian embeddedness converge, is obligation. Every major tradition in Western ethics, and most traditions outside it, arrives eventually at some account of what you owe, to reason, to others, to your community, to the structures that made your life possible. The language differs, the derivation differs, the content varies significantly between traditions, but the structural move is consistent. From philosophical reflection, you arrive at a domain of the obligatory, a set of things that are not merely optional for a person who takes ethics seriously. The traditions disagree about what fills that domain. They agree that the domain exists and that filling it is the business of moral philosophy.
What no tradition feels is the territory just beyond that domain.
The obligatory, once established, still leaves open the question of what you do with the remaining space, the hours and years and choices that are not adjudicated by any ethical principle, that no framework claims as its territory.
Most people experience that space as enormous, and most people have been trained in the ways that Chunk 8 examined to feel uneasy inside it. A life organized entirely around meeting obligations at least has the virtue of keeping that open space filled. You are always doing something required. The unease of genuine openness never quite arrives because the schedule of obligation never quite ends. This is where the gap between ethical theory and personal meaning stops being an abstract philosophical observation and becomes something you actually live inside. The traditions that have thought most carefully about obligation can, at their best, help you decide which of your inherited obligations correspond to genuine ethical claims and which correspond to social pressure dressed in moral clothing. That is not a small gift, but even after that sorting, even once you have separated the obligations that track real ethical content from the ones that were installed for social convenience, you are left with the question that philosophy hands back to you without answering. The question of what you want your life to be. What you are trying to do with the time that is yours. What it means to you specifically to have lived rather than to have merely complied. No authority exists that can answer that question on your behalf. This is not a temporary situation pending the right philosopher or the right framework. It is the permanent structure of the problem. The question of personal meaning is not a philosophical question in the sense that ethical theory is philosophical. It is not the kind of question that yields to rigorous argument because rigorous argument requires premises, and the premises that matter here, what you value, what you want, what kind of life feels worth living to you, are not derivable from anything external. They are only accessible by looking inward, and looking inward requires a self that has not been entirely organized around managing other people's claims. The philosophical traditions did not fail in leaving this gap. The gap is not a failure of rigor or imagination. It is the exact point where philosophy acknowledges the limits of its own method. What can be argued, philosophy argues. What can only be lived, philosophy points toward and then steps back. The space it points toward is the space where you have to act without permission, without the authorization of a principle that tells you this is the right direction, without the comfort of a framework that has pre-sorted the question. You act on your own account, on your own judgment, in service of a sense of meaning that you have to construct rather than inherit.
That construction is not comfortable. There is a reason most people prefer a life organized around obligation to a life organized around chosen meaning. The obligations arrive ready-made. They have names. They have social backing. When you fulfill them, something in the environment acknowledges the fulfillment. Chosen meaning comes without any of that scaffolding. You build it yourself, and the building is uncertain work, and no one confirms that you are doing it correctly, because there is no correct here in the sense that ethics can produce. There is only what is genuinely yours, arrived at through genuine examination, held with genuine conviction. That is a much lonelier kind of certainty than the certainty that comes from fulfilling a requirement. The relevance to the question this episode is asking, about what you actually owe and to whom, is this. Every framework that tells you what you owe is working at one level of the question. At that level, the frameworks have real things to say, and the examination they demand is worth undertaking. But underneath that level is a prior question that the frameworks do not reach. The question of whose life you are living. The question of whether the person who is fulfilling all these obligations has ever actually asked what they would choose, if choice were genuinely available. Most people have never been invited to ask that question with real seriousness, because the invitation would have to come from within, and the interior space from which it might emerge has been occupied for a long time by the administration of expectations that arrived without asking permission. The gap philosophy leaves is not an emptiness. It is the shape of the work that is specifically yours to do. No tradition can enter it. No obligation fills it. The question of what your life is for sits there, waiting, for the moment you are willing to stop treating someone else's answer as a substitute for your own.
There is a difference between the weight of what you have chosen to carry and the weight of what was simply placed on you. Both feel heavy. Both require effort to hold. But they are not the same thing, and treating them as equivalent is one of the more consequential confusions a person can carry through their life. The claim that chosen responsibility is the only meaningful form of responsibility is not a way of saying that responsibility is optional or that you are free to simply decline obligations that inconvenience you. The claim is more precise than that. It is that the category of genuine responsibility, the kind that actually corresponds to something in your values, that you can defend from the inside rather than just comply with from the outside, requires active selection. It requires that you were in a position to refuse, that you understood what you were taking on, and that you took it on anyway, for reasons you can articulate in terms of what actually matters to you. When all three of those conditions are met, the responsibility carries a different kind of weight. Not a heavier weight in the sense of burden, but a more solid weight. The weight of something that belongs to you because you reached out and took it. Contrast that with the obligations that arrived before you had the capacity to select them. Before you had a worked-out sense of your own values. Before you had language for what you actually wanted. Those obligations were not taken on, they were installed, and the installation was so early and so thorough that by the time you were old enough to examine them, they were already present tense. They were not things you believed, they were the ground beneath your beliefs. And the question of whether you actually endorse them, whether they correspond to anything you would choose if choice were genuinely available, tends to go unasked, because asking it feels like questioning the floor. The mechanism here is worth understanding clearly. When an obligation is chosen, the relationship between you and that obligation is active. You are the source of it. You can revisit it, reassess it, hold it up against what you currently know and value, and either reaffirm it or revise it. The obligation is responsive to you because you are the one who created it. When an obligation is inherited, through family, through community, through the social installation that the previous part of this conversation examined, the relationship inverts. You are not the source, you are the recipient. The obligation was already there when you arrived. And obligations that were already there when you arrived tend to be treated as fixed features of the landscape rather than as decisions that can be revisited. The difference between those two relationships is the difference between being the author of your responsibilities and being their administrator. Someone you trust is going through something genuinely difficult, and you find yourself staying up late, rearranging your schedule, showing up when it costs you something. You do not experience that as a debt being paid. You experience it as an expression of what you actually care about. And the difficulty involved does not feel like a penalty. It feels like something you chose to absorb because the relationship and the person are worth it to you. That quality, the sense that the responsibility is an extension of your own values rather than an external imposition, is what chosen responsibility produces. It is not that the difficulty disappears, it is that the difficulty makes sense from inside your own framework. The consequence of understanding this is not that you go looking for a way to shed everything that was handed to you. That is not the point, and it is not the path. The point is something more internal and more demanding. It is that every obligation you carry deserves to be examined against the question of whether you would choose it now, from where you actually stand, with the values you actually hold. Some of what you were handed will survive that examination without revision. You will look at it clearly, understand why you would choose it even if you had not inherited it, and carry it forward with a different quality of conviction. The conviction of someone who has endorsed rather than merely complied. Some of what you were handed will not survive the examination. It will turn out on close inspection to correspond to nothing in your actual values, to be a piece of social scaffolding that arrived in the language of ethics because that language made it harder to question. The examination is the thing. The willingness to hold up each obligation and ask whether you are the one who actually chose it, or whether it was chosen for you, and you have simply never had occasion to notice that you had not been consulted.
There is an unresolved boundary at the edge of this, and it would be dishonest to paper over it. The conditions for genuinely free choice are never fully present. You always choose from a position that was partly shaped for you. Your values were formed in a particular context. Your sense of what matters was influenced by forces that preceded your capacity to filter them. Even the obligation you examine carefully and actively endorse is an endorsement made by a self that was itself partly constructed by inheritance. The freedom available here is not absolute. It is not the freedom of a person who arrived from nowhere, with values formed entirely from scratch, making choices in a vacuum. That person does not exist. What does exist is the difference between a choice made with awareness and a compliance that has never been examined. That gap between examined endorsement and unexamined inheritance is where the meaningful work happens. You cannot step fully outside the conditions that formed you, but you can look at them. You can hold what you carry and ask whether you would pick it up again today, knowing what you know. The act of asking changes something in the nature of the carrying. The obligation does not disappear, but your relationship to it shifts from passive reception to active decision. And that shift, however incomplete and however constrained by the conditions you were given, is the closest thing available to genuine responsibility. The kind that belongs to you because you looked at it and said yes, rather than because it was already there when you arrived and leaving felt impossible. The safest path is the one that costs the most. That sounds wrong at first, or at least counterintuitive. The safest path, in the terms most people understand safety, is the one where nothing is risked. You meet the expectations, you absorb the obligations, you show up for every person who has decided that showing up is what you owe them. Nothing collapses, no one is disappointed. No relationship ends in the particular devastating way that comes from refusal. The surface of a life organized this way looks stable, and in a narrow sense, it is. But stability of that kind carries a hidden accounting, and the accounting runs in only one direction. The paradox at the center of this is not rhetorical. It is structural. The more completely you fulfill every external obligation, the less of a life you actually have, and the less of yourself remains to have it with. Not because obligations are inherently destructive, but because a life spent servicing the expectations of others is not a life you are living. It is a life you are managing on someone else's behalf. The person at the center of all that management, the one doing the work, absorbing the costs, arranging themselves to fit each demand, has, in the most practical sense, declined to exist. Not violently,
not dramatically, through accumulation. One adjustment at a time, one suppressed preference at a time, one, of course I will, at a time, until the question of what you actually want has gone unasked for so long that it stops feeling like a question at all. The explicit name for this is the unlived life. Not a metaphor, an accounting term for years that were spent but not inhabited. The unlived life is not the same as an unhappy life, and conflating them is one of the ways this cost stays invisible. A person living almost entirely in service of inherited obligation can experience genuine moments of warmth, genuine connection, genuine satisfaction in the work of being depended upon. Those experiences are real. They are not evidence against the unlived life. They are the thing that makes the unlived life so difficult to see. You can be meaningfully present in someone else's story while being almost entirely absent from your own. The presence and the absence coexist, and from the outside, and often from the inside, only the presence registers. What registers, if it ever does, is something quieter and more diffuse. A sense that the days are being spent on something that is not quite yours. A kind of tiredness that sleep does not address because it is not physical exhaustion, it is the fatigue of living at an angle to yourself for an extended period. An awareness that the version of you doing all this fulfilling is a practiced, functional version, and that somewhere underneath it there is a different kind of attention, a different set of desires, something that would choose differently if it were ever asked.
Most people never name this. The naming requires a prior step, the acknowledgement that the life you are living was shaped primarily by forces you did not choose, organized around a set of obligations you absorbed rather than selected. That acknowledgement carries real weight, because once you have made it, you cannot unmake it. You cannot continue in the same way, with the same quality of unawareness. Something shifts in your relationship to the pattern, even before you have done anything about it. This is where the second part of the compound lands, and it lands harder than the first. The deepest cost of unexamined obligation is not only the unlived life already accrued, it is the structural fact that genuine care, the kind that is freely given, that means something both to the giver and the receiver, depends on first having a self that does the caring. You cannot give from a position of genuine freedom if you have organized your entire existence around the premise that freedom is not available to you. What comes out of that position is not generosity. It is compliance in the emotional register. It looks like care, feels like care in the moment, and lacks the one quality that makes care real, the fact that it is chosen. The person who has never established that they are free not to give is not capable of genuinely giving. They are capable of producing the behaviors associated with giving, and those behaviors have real effects on the people receiving them. But the underlying dynamic is different in a way that eventually becomes felt by everyone involved, even if no one can name it precisely. There is a quality of freely given attention that is unmistakably different from dutiful attention, and most people who have experienced both can recognize the difference without being able to articulate what exactly changes. What changes is origin. One comes from a person who is present by choice. The other comes from a person who is present because absence felt impossible. Reclaiming the self that does the caring is not a precondition for some theoretical future of authentic giving. It is what is at stake right now, in the actual relationships you are already inside. When you look at the obligations you carry, not to discard them, but to ask whether you have ever actually chosen them, you are not performing an act of withdrawal. You are performing the one act that makes genuine presence possible.
The examination is not the enemy of connection. It is the thing that makes connection something other than management.
The years spent in unexamined obligation do not disappear when you begin to ask the question. The accumulated absence does not resolve cleanly. What has not been lived cannot be retroactively added back into the account. The recognition itself carries a particular kind of grief, not sharp grief, but the slow weight of understanding that a span of time was spent at a distance from yourself, and that the distance was not inevitable, but was maintained by a set of premises that were never examined, because examining them felt too dangerous, or too disloyal, or simply too strange to contemplate. What you do with that recognition is genuinely open. There is no single direction the examination has to go, but the examination has to happen, and it has to happen with real honesty about what it reveals. Not what you wish it revealed, not what the frameworks you absorbed would want it to reveal, but what you actually find when you hold up each obligation and ask who put it there, and whether you would put it there again today. Some of what you find will be worth keeping, and you will keep it differently, not as a debt, but as a choice, which is a different kind of weight entirely. Some of what you find will have no ground under it at all, just the long pressure of expectation, dressed in the only language it could find to make itself difficult to refuse. The unlived life is not behind you as a fixed loss. It is present tense. It is the question of what you are doing right now with the time and the self that are yours. The safest path, the one that fulfills every expectation, is still available. So is the other kind. There is a question this entire conversation has been circling, and it is time to face it directly. What does it actually mean to owe nothing? Not as a rhetorical provocation, not as a posture of detachment, but as a genuine philosophical position that a person might actually inhabit. Because if the answer was simple, if it meant indifference, or the clean, unbothered withdrawal from everyone who has ever needed something from you, it would not be worth spending 12 nights on. Simple answers do not require this much examination to earn. The claim has never been that you should give nothing. The claim is about origin, about what it means when the giving comes from a place that was never genuinely free to withhold. When you trace back through everything this conversation has held, the guilt that tracked violated expectations rather than violated principles, the self that disappeared through maximum compliance, the values absorbed before there was a self capable of selecting them, the accusation of selfishness deployed by people whose comfort depended on your agreement, the love that was slowly hollowed by being pressed into service as duty. When you trace all of that back, you find the same mechanism operating at every level. Not cruelty, not conspiracy, just the steady, structural pressure of a social world that runs on compliance, dressed in the moral language that makes compliance feel like virtue. And underneath all of it, that accounting, the unlived life. Not behind you as something cleanly finished, but present tense, active, a set of hours that are being spent right now, and the question of what they are being spent on, and whether the person spending them was ever actually asked. Here is what shifts when you take the position seriously. When you arrive at an act of care, staying up for someone, showing up when it costs something, remaining present inside the difficulty of another person's life. And that arrival comes from a position where leaving was genuinely possible, where the refusal was available to you and you declined to take it. The quality of what you bring is different. It is not the quality of someone performing the behaviors associated with care while privately absorbing the costs of having no other option. It is the quality of someone who chose to be there. That distinction is not theoretical. People feel it,
even when they cannot name it. There is something in the texture of freely given attention that registers differently from attention given because withdrawal felt impossible. And most people who have experienced both know the difference from the inside without needing it explained. The person who has genuinely established that they are free not to give is the only person capable of giving in a way that carries full weight. This is not paradoxical in the clever sense, it is structurally true. Generosity requires that the alternative was real. Care requires that the choice was made. Presence requires that absence was an option that was considered and set aside. Without the genuine availability of refusal, what you offer is not care in the fullest sense. It is the output of a system that has no other mode. And the people you love deserve more than that. The relationships that matter to you deserve more than the compliance of a person who has never examined whether the compliance is chosen. This is where the macro loop closes, but not into tidiness. The philosophy of owing nothing is not a philosophy of giving nothing. It is the precondition for giving anything that genuinely belongs to you. It is the ground from which real love becomes possible, not the love that is performed because the performing is what holds the relationship together, not the love that is maintained through fear of what happens when the maintenance stops, but love as a repeated active decision made by someone who has looked at the question honestly and keeps answering in the same direction. The grief that came up at the end of the previous conversation, the slow weight of recognizing a span of time spent at a distance from yourself, does not resolve here. That recognition does not arrive cleanly, and it does not exit cleanly either. The years that were spent at an angle to your own life do not get reabsorbed. What you were not able to inhabit stays uninhabited. But the recognition changes what is still available. The present tense is still open. The obligations you carry can still be held up and examined, not to be abandoned wholesale, but to be genuinely assessed. Some will turn out to be things you would choose again, from where you actually stand, and carrying them forward with that knowledge changes the quality of the carrying. Some will turn out to have nothing underneath them except the long pressure of expectation, and knowing that changes what you do next.
The question this has always been about, what your particular life is for, what you are doing with the time and the self that are yours, cannot be answered by any tradition, system, or external authority. That gap between ethical theory and personal meaning, the gap where philosophy eventually runs out and you have to act without permission, is not a failure of thought. It is the exact space where the question becomes yours. No framework closes it for you. No correct sequence of reasoning produces the answer. The answer, if there is one, comes from the kind of looking that this conversation has been asking you to do. The honest holding up of each obligation, each assumed debt, each piece of inherited moral vocabulary, and asking who put it there, and whether you would put it there again, and what you actually want to do with the hours that are still in front of you. The openness of that is genuinely uncomfortable. This is not a philosophy that arrives with instructions. It arrives with the terrifying availability of genuine choice, which means the weight of genuine responsibility for what you do with it. Chosen responsibility, the only kind that carries full weight, is also the kind you cannot blame on anyone else. When you select it consciously, for reasons you can name, in service of values you actually hold, it belongs to you entirely. That is both the freedom and the cost of the position. What you do with the recognition is genuinely open. There is no right answer that applies across all lives, and this conversation has not been trying to produce one. The claim, from the beginning, has been more precise and more difficult than any single directive could capture. It is that the life worth living, not in the sense of happiness as a metric,
but in the sense of a life that actually corresponds to something in you. Begins with the willingness to ask which of the obligations you carry were ever yours to begin with, and to sit with what you find without flinching from it. The question is still open, so is the time. Good night.